teachers and students haven't had a lot of practice on designing digital learning experiences.
And our next speaker is Dr. Victor Lim Fei. Currently, he is assistant professor at the English Language and Literature Department, National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. He's my neighbor. We work in the same corridor, actually. His teaching and research interests are, some of the most exciting, today. It's on multimodality, multiliteracies in education, embodied teaching. I think he will explain a bit more about that later. And multimodal discourse analysis. You can see here that communication today or information today is presented, using some form of technology, which allows people to not just use language, but also use a wider range of modalities like verbal information, non-verbal information, voice and visuals as well. He is very, very productive. He has written a lot. And his most recent book, Designing Learning with Embodied Teaching, just came out this year. And it took him only 3 months to write that book, correct, Victor? Ladies and gentlemen, Victor will be sharing with us, on his presentation. The topic is multimodal literacy in a digital age. Can it be taught? Let's welcome Victor, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Pak Willie, for the very kind introduction. I wish it took me 3 months. Okay, let me share my screen and get this going.
I think what he said to me back then was he wrote about 500 words a day. So in 3 months, he was able to put together all the first draft at least.
Are you able to see my screen as well?
Yes, good, excellent.
Thank you very much, Prof. Zulkifli, Ibu Nurul, and Ibu Yeni. Thank you very much for the very kind invitation to speak at this webinar. And I'm also very appreciative of the opportunity to be given to speak on a topic that I'm very passionate about. Thanks, Mark, for your fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. Now, I'm going to talk about multimodal literacy in a digital age. And what I'm centrally concerned about in my research and teaching work really is about how and what we should be teaching our learners today, particularly in the context of the digital age. So I'm going to use the next 20 minutes or so to share with you some of my thoughts and some of my ideas with regard to the implications on curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, on how we can cultivate multimodal literacy in our students. Now, some of the strategies, specific strategies will be in the publications that I have, and I will point you to them as well that you can look up if you are interested. The 21st century has seen two aspects in which have shaped the way that we communicate with one another, the digital and the multimodal turn. The digital technologies have opened up new ways of multimodal meaning making. As Mark alluded to just now, the information system landscape that we are living in is very complex. It talks about the 4 V's, the 4 M's, and this is really accentuated by the fact that advancement in digital technology has made different ways of meaning making possible. I find that multimodality as a field of discipline and as a research methodology offers a very useful set of lens for us to interrogate the digital, to interrogate and understand the way in which meaning making is taking place. So for instance, we talk about semiotic technologies, which Van Leuven, Jonov, and O'Halloran describes as resources for knowledge representation and enactment of social practices. Now, what does this mean? So if you think about in a classroom, a PowerPoint presentation that you use, which is very typical in many classrooms today, how is knowledge represented when a PowerPoint is used? Think about the kind of pedagogic relations that you have with the student when you are using a PowerPoint to teach. Now, the pandemic has caused all of us to go virtual. So think about the kind of technology that's being used in this case, a Zoom video conference. How is knowledge represented? And how is the kind of relationship that I have with you enacted through a Zoom video conference? So these are good questions for us to think about as we explore the digital and multimodal turn. I'm going to give you an example here, a thought experiment. I want you to read these two words in your head. Do you read them differently? Now, if you're like me, I will read the first one as water and the second, water. Why? They are just two same words. But the very fact of the matter is we are hardwired to respond to multimodal communication. So obviously in the second picture, you see a different font with a certain context as a background. Theo van Leeuwen talks about the turn towards the multimodal. We recognize that many formerly austere genres such as textbooks and documents nowadays have become more multimodal. You see pictures, you see figures, you see color, you see statistics. In many of the documents, the communication that even the government sends to you. The fact of the matter is we live in a multimodal world. And what is more interesting really is the fact that the advancement in technology, productivity tools like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint have made multimodal text design available and accessible to all of us. For us to construct a multimodal text, it's as simple as just a few cut and paste, mixing, remeshing, using a few editorial tools on your laptop, on your mobile device, and you're able to create very interesting multimodal text, not just for ourselves, but for our children as well. Günter Kress, back in 1995, reflected about the changes that we have in terms of the resources we give to our children. And he made this statement, he says that what we make available to the child is a central factor in what the child will and can do. Think about yourself growing up, the kind of tools, technologies you had for meaning making. A pen, paper, color pencils, crayons, magic ink, magic pens, for you to express your ideas and your identities. Now think about our young children today, our young people today, the kind of tools and technologies they have to express their ideas and identities, making YouTube videos, uploading posts on social media, and the posts are not just in language. I mean, if you look at Instagram, it's all images in nature. Editing software that's at their disposal on a mobile device for them to make interesting memes, collages. And these are ways in which they're expressing their ideas and their identities. So this is the kind of communicative environment that we are living in and our young children are growing up in. But what is of interest, of course, is the work by Andres Lecher looking at pizza. And this is almost a decade ago. Many of us may be very familiar with the notion of the digital divide. And when we think about a digital divide, we think about access to infrastructure, access to computers, equipment, and hardware. But Lecher mentioned that, well, one of the challenges in the digital divide is the fact that many young people themselves who may have grown up with a computer, they may not possess the literacies, the skills to navigate the digital environment. And so he coined the idea of the second digital divide, or digital divide 2.0, which is not so much about access to equipment and computers, although that may still be an issue in many parts of the world in terms of the cities and the rural areas. But what is of emerging concern really is about the knowledge, skills, and literacies for our young today to effectively navigate the digital environment. Now, when we talk about our young people today, our youth, our children, we may be thinking about the notion of digital natives, coined by Mark Prensky, talking about the millennial learners, many of them sitting in our classrooms who have grown up with a host of relatively new technologies. They connect with their friends physically, but also virtually through social network and technology-mediated approaches. But in recent years, we also recognize that the idea of a digital native as a homogeneous group can be contested. Even though digital natives have grown up using technologies, they may not all be equally adept in digital skills. digital natives may not also form a homogeneous group because many of them have differential access to, well, technology, as well as opportunities, as well as guidance from the family, from the teachers. And as a result, digital natives may not all grow up already proficient in the use of technology. They may not grow up intuitively having that kind of, or innately already having that kind of literacies to navigate the complex information landscape that we are all part of today. So what I have done in the first part of my presentation essentially is to share with you the changing communication environment that we are in now, the digital and the multimodal turn, as well as the digital profile of our students. The big question for us as educators really is, what should our response be? The change of the environment, the change of our students' profile. How can we meet their needs? Now, one of the greatest challenge, I think, for educators and the education system is for us to be able to teach in a way that we were not taught before, or to teach things that we have not been taught before. But I think this is a demand that is placed on us as researchers, as educators in the classroom. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts I have in how we can respond to this challenge. Now, the conviction that students require critical competencies that move beyond traditional literacy practices is not something that is new. Educators and scholars from different traditions and disciplines have long documented the requirements for new literacy skills and pedagogical practices so that we are able to equip our students with the necessary literacies to exercise critical thinking, to be able to represent their ideas creatively in a multimodal digital environment. So specifically for the next part of my presentation, I will look at three main aspects: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Now, in the interest of time, I will not be able to go into the specifics of each of them, but I'm going to share with you some broad thoughts and ideas I have with regard to some of the shifts that we need to make, as well as some examples of how this can be done. Now, when we talk about the educators' response to the changing world, the most famous group of all might come to mind. The New London Group in 1996 published a manifesto for multiliteracies, and they introduced the notion of multiliteracies to the world. Now, we are 20 years into the 21st century, and many education systems have embraced the notion of multiliteracies and have integrated it in different ways into their curricula. So let's look at what the New London Group talk about when they introduced the notion of multiliteracies. Now, they say that they add two multis to literacies, the multi of an enormous and significant difference in context and patterns of communication, recognizing the kind of different backgrounds that our students come with, the kind of different experiences, literacy practices that they may have at home, and the multi of multimodality, recognizing, again, the different ways in which meanings can be made in the classroom, beyond a privileging of language itself. So what does this mean for literacy today? Now, I wrote about this in a publication for a colleague in Sweden. And the idea really is to be considered literate in this day and age is to be able to effectively communicate multimodally. What does this mean? It demands an evolution of our literacy curriculum to move beyond the teaching and learning of reading in print to also reading both in print and on screen. What difference does the mediation of screen make? Are there new literacies for digital reading? Well, the argument must be yes, or the answer must be yes. From that of reading of books to that of reading of books and viewing multimodal text critically, Mark has shared about the complex information system landscape that we are living in, the nature of the text that we experience on the internet with hyperlinks, with multimedia embedded within it. From writing to writing and typing, from speaking to speaking and representing. Now, in this presentation that I'm making to you, I'm speaking, but I'm not just speaking. I mean, I have a deck of slides that represent some of the ideas that I would like to communicate with you as well. So this is the new ways of communication and interaction that we should help our students develop literacies for. in. Now, the term multimodal literacy was developed by Carrie Jewett and Günter Kress in their book, and is in recognition of the fact that meanings are made, redistributed, received, interpreted, and remade in interpretation through many representational and communicative modes. So what does a 21st century curricula look like? Now, at the turn of the century, Professor Len Unsworth talks about how many of the fundamentals of established language-based literacy pedagogies will endure in the foreseeable future. In other words, language is still important. The skills of reading, writing, speaking, listening remains foundational for our literacy curriculum. But one thing that he noted was that these skills are by no means sufficient for the development of the kinds of literacy practices that already characterize and continuously evolving information age of the new millennium. So this was made about 20 years ago. More recently, my colleague Sheila Winninger wrote a book on how we need to broaden our curriculum from a focus on language skills to incorporate different aspects of literacy. And I think that is a very, very important book in terms of making a case within the Singapore context that we need to recognize that literacy teaching and learning should not just focus on language skills alone, but also incorporate other aspects of the multimodal and digital age that we are living in. In a project that I have with a team of colleagues at NIE looking at the Singapore English language classroom, we went into the classroom and observed how teachers were teaching literacy lessons. And one of the things that we noted that was important was that while the teaching of critical viewing of multimodal text and creative representing of multimodal text skills were incorporated into the curriculum documents, there was a challenge in terms of enacting it in the classroom. So what do I mean? Many a times teachers will use videos in the classroom. They will use posters in the classroom. So multimodal text, authentic text, which is great. But many a times it is used to serve the learning of language rather than to recognize that there is a set of knowledge and skills related to viewing that needs to be taught, as well as the fact that there's a set of knowledge and skill related to making, representing that needs to be taught. So while it's in the curriculum, the next challenge that we need to think about really is in terms of pedagogy. How do we teach viewing and representing? Now, this is one of the outcomes or goals that we see for a child, a student that is multimodally literate. The child is aware of the meaning potential and choices in the production of the multimodal text. And as a result, they are able to make apt choices in the way they construct and present knowledge, in the way they represent meanings to express their ideas and identities. So this is the goal of a multiliteracy pedagogy that we want to have. But how does it look like? Well, there are some tenets of it in it that has been expressed by scholars internationally over time. Some tenets of a 21st century multiliteracy pedagogy will be one that bridges between life work, school literacies. So a connection between the student home, a connection between the student's home literacy practices, the kind of practices they enact on social media, with what they are learning in school. Mo and her colleague a long time ago talks about how it was important for the schools and educators to think seriously about tapping on students' fund of knowledge, the kind of understanding, knowledge, and schema that they bring to the classroom. And more recently, John Porter and Julian Mendoga talks about how we can create a third space in the classroom for learning. Now, what does this mean? I'll share with you a little bit more later on. But it's about thinking about how social media, video production can be brought into the classroom as part of the teaching and learning experience of the child. Now, questioning is important. But as Mark pointed out just now, and I like that, it's the understanding that inquiry needs to be scaffolded. One of the observations we make in the classroom is that teachers tend to teach viewing skills through asking a series of questions. Now, the challenge really is whether students already have the kind of requisite understanding and knowledge to be able to respond to the question. So, of course, Mark alluded to the work of Bayes, whether before questioning has the explicit step-by-step teaching taken place, has the modeling taken place. So, while questioning is important, it needs to be built on a foundation of knowledge and skills that have already been taught to the students. Otherwise, it's just about testing the students' general knowledge and comprehension and hoping that through the experience, somehow magically, the students will develop into critical viewers. I always tell the teachers that I work with that your role is a teacher, not a tester. So you should be teaching, not testing. But the question, of course, to us is, then what should we teach? What is the knowledge that we teach? Now, my proposition really is that we need to teach a set of meta language for the different multimodal texts that we introduce into the classroom. And this is not my idea. I mean, the New London Group has talked about how it's important to have a meta language to denote semiotic resources beyond language, so as to describe meanings in various realms. This work has also been picked up by Len Unsworth and his colleagues in Australia. And he argues that teachers and students need the kind of meta-language for talking about language, images, sound, and so forth. The kind of meta-language gives students and teachers a means of comparing texts, of determining what semiotic choices were made, and the kind of effects of particular choices rather than others. In fact, in a recent project that they have completed, published in this book called Functional Grammatics, they talk about introducing a set of language, meta-language for teaching of multimodal literacy. And they reported that the meta-language can structure the students noticing, offering a fresh view of choices that they may have taken for granted. The meta-language was also not only turning up in the students' writing and talking in their production, but also that they appear to reshape the students' way of thinking. So can critical thinking be taught? Yes, but we need to guide the way of thinking. Not what to think, but how to think. So in a project that we did in Singapore, introducing a set of meta language, we had positive responses from the students. And really we argue that multimodal literacy is developed by providing students with a language to be able to describe and discuss multimodal text. And with that meta language, you are able then to guide the students on where to look and what to look up for in a multimodal text, so that they are able to have the language to make meaning with, and they'll be more sensitized, more aware of the kind of choices that are made in the design, in the construction of a multimodal text. Now, in the interest of time, I will not be able to share with you some of this meta language, but over the years, this has been a trajectory of work that I've been doing. So we have developed meta languages for the teaching of posters, print advertisement, for videos, for video games recently that was published, for digital multimodal composition. So in terms of making, how can we support and guide students representing? It's not so simple as just telling the students, okay, go make a video. What are the skills and knowledge that students need? And how can teachers develop that kind of, how can teachers guide them in creative representing? And some of the work that might be upcoming in terms of meta language for the different types of multimodal text includes apps, digital news, picture books, transmedia narratives. So if you're interested in some of these works, I have a link on some of the papers that I have written on this that you can follow up on.
2 minutes, Victor.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so very quickly, in terms of pedagogy of representing, how can we provide opportunities for students to represent their ideas and experiences through multimodal representations? How can we guide students in making effective multimodal representations? And we incorporate aspects of design thinking as a way to support students in that regard. And a big question that many of us are grappling with really is how can we assess and evaluate students' multimodal representation? And I have 1 minute to go through that. Some key ideas is to remember the intent of assessment, which is feedback. and not just to give a grade, but to give meaningful feedback to the child. To think about how we can democratize the classroom in terms of assessment so that there's a little bit more peer assessment going on rather than just the teacher being the source of rightness or wrongness. Gunter Kress has made a lot of arguments in terms of how we need to recognize students' expression of learning and how we can value students' multimodal meaning making. So what does this mean in our context? Well, some questions that as educators we can reflect on, and these are things that I'm still thinking about as well, will be what are the different types of student experiences, what are the different types of learning that students experience in various ways of multimodal composition. So after a trip to the zoo, they can write, for instance, an essay, a composition, or you can get them to draw, make a comic strip. What are the different types of learning that is being expressed through that? What are the gains and losses to the rubrics used? And what are some of the alternative ways in which teachers can assess students' learning in multimodal composition? And this is my last slide. Can multimodal literacy be taught? Well, the answer must be a yes. And here I summarize the 4 things that I've talked about in terms of instructional objectives, how we can incorporate elements of multimodal literacy in it, in terms of content, how we can develop meta-language to support the learning and teaching of multiliteracies, in terms of strategies, there's very interesting framework that has been developed, as well as in terms of feedback. How do we think about more carefully the types of learning that different multimodal representations can bring, as well as how can we recognize the different signs of learning that emerge from students' work. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Victor, clap, 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 please. That was a very, very good presentation. And I like the visuals, the images that you use on your slides, looking very multimodal to me. Victor, I have some small questions for you to help us understand basically what the whole idea behind multimodal literacies and multimodal teaching is all about. You mentioned early on about the new digital divide. I think that is real. I'm glad that you mentioned that in your presentation. I remember seeing a report recently that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Basically, the report provided an interim assessment of the past 3 months of remote learning, basically, where kids and teachers have to use technology to communicate, to teach lessons and things like that. And the overall assessment is that, well, the whole thing has been a flop. It has been a failure. And one of the reasons that I remember the report said was that, yes, some of the reasons that the students are digital users and consumers, but they are not yet digital learners. Perhaps the same applies to teachers as well. Your comment on that? Is that something that we need to work on, helping students to become users and also learners?
Absolutely, absolutely. So apart from being users, they need to be learners, which means that they need to have the kind of literacies needed in order to use, to be able to transfer what they are practicing out there in their own communicative environment to the formal setting. I think one of the more interesting thing that I want to make in response to the question really, or the observation that the whole move towards digital learning has been a flop, is really the fact that, to be fair, teachers and students haven't had a lot of practice on designing digital learning experiences. Students are not so familiar with digital learning experiences. So it was a very sudden shift online. So one of the commentary that I've written really is to reflect on the kind of gains and losses of digital learning. So while there are certain losses, there are gains as well. We recognize that digital learning can never really replicate a face-to-face physical learning, but there are certain positive aspects, certain value of it as well. And one of the reasons why it may not be fully harnessed is because, well, teachers simply didn't have the opportunities to hone their craft to practice various interesting ways to explore different forms of pedagogy in the digital learning context. And I think, I really hope that in the post-pandemic era, there will be a greater recognition of the value of digital learning, and there will be more opportunities that's provided for teachers to hone their pedagogies in that regard. Now, if you talk about digital literacies of students, it's the same thing. If they have not had a lot of opportunities to practice digital literacies in the formal learning context, then you will not be surprised that in a crash course of within 2 months, some of these less desirable things might have happened. But if they have had more opportunities, I think we are able then to intentionally cultivate the kind of multimodal literacy, the kind of digital literacies we find in our students.
Yes, I fully agree with your assessment. I think there's still a lot more that we need to learn in order to develop our, basically capacity and capabilities in using the digital technology for teaching and learning purposes. Victor, here's another report. Very, very interesting report that I've seen. Some schools get very excited about using technology, and some educators also get very excited. And some countries actually have implemented the replacing basically the traditional type of reading, print reading, and they bring in laptop computers, tablets, and so on. The idea is for the students to begin reading screen materials or digital materials. But after a while, after trying out for a few times, they find that screen reading actually has some unwanted consequences. Students are not able to focus on their reading. So what happens then is they then decided to, okay, from now on, let's not use laptop computers or tablets. Let's go back to print reading. What is the research out there in terms of reading comprehension, in terms of knowledge that students can gain from doing print reading, and also as opposed to doing digital or screen reading?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very good question and a very important issue to address. I have wrote about it in a paper that's under review at the moment. And the point really is that the reality of the communication landscape, the reality of the communication environment today will involve students to participate in digital reading. So of course, we know that there are certain losses or certain hazards in digital reading, health hazards, screen time, back on the eyesight. But the reality is that during their studying days, during their working days, they will be involved in such literacy practices. And therefore, the responsibility of our teachers is to guide them in digital reading. And the argument I'm making in my paper really is that there's a set of literacies related to that. Now, for instance, studies have shown that students tend to apply their strategies for social reading, so as scrolling on social media on their handphone, to reading, for instance, a comprehension passage on screen. So when you scroll through a social media feed, what do? You skim and you scan, right? You skim, you scan, you practice skimming and scanning strategy. Yeah. And now when you give them a serious reading task, a long passage on the screen, immediately the intuitive response for them when they are presented with the same interface is to skim and to scan. And which is why you need to help them understand that you should be guided by the purpose of reading rather than be distracted by the interface, which intuitively we will respond to. So my bottom line really is that there's a set of literacies for digital reading that needs to be explicated, that needs to be taught. And Mark has mentioned earlier on as well in terms of hyperlink text. How do we explore the various connections, but not losing sight of the main purpose or goal of why you are reading this in the first place? Yes. So digital reading offers a lot of opportunities for learning, for knowledge building, and I think it's something that we need to take seriously in our teaching.
Yes. Hopefully, in the future, our students will be able to read, from their screen, and also have a deeper understanding of what they have just read. Just like in the old days when they read books or printed materials. Thank you so much, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please clap, clap, clap again for Victor Lim.